So my sermon title this morning should say, "Each one teach one." And I had never actually heard that phrase before Maya brought it up when we were talking about what to talk about on Sunday. And we were having a conversation about the show Queer Eye for the Straight Guy, and she threw out that phrase that one of the people had thrown out that phrase, "Each one teach one," and I thought, oh, that's a really interesting phrase. I bet I can make a sermon out of that. And so I latched onto the phrase and said, let's go with it. And then a little while later, she sent me this information about the origin, yeah, that doesn't sound right, of the phrase. And I realized that actually this is an extremely important phrase for this time and day. And the history, according to Wikipedia, is that "each one teach one" originated in the United States during the time of slavery, when Africans were denied education, including learning to read. And many, if not most, enslaved people were kept in a state of ignorance about anything beyond their immediate circumstances, which were under the control of the owners, the lawmakers, and authorities. When an enslaved person learned or was taught to read, it became their duty to teach someone else, spawning the phrase, "each one teach one." And I just want us to sit with that just for a moment. And I'm going to requote what Wikipedia said. "Many, if not most, enslaved people were kept in a state of ignorance about anything beyond their immediate circumstances, which were under control of owners, the lawmakers, and authorities." In Florida this week, they mandated that children will be taught that slavery benefited the slaves. According to an article by NBC, they wrote, quote, "Florida's public schools will now teach students that some black people benefited from slavery because it taught them useful skills. Part of new African American history standards approved Wednesday that were blasted by a state teachers union as a step backwards." The Florida State Board of Education's new standards include controversial language about how slaves developed skills which, in some instances, could be applied for their personal benefit, according to a 216-page document about the state's 2023 standards in social studies posted by the Florida Department of Education. I'm going to read that last little sentence again. The state's 2023 standards by the Florida Department of Education. This is not 1923. The article continues, "Other language has drawn the ire of some educators and education advocates, includes teaching about how black people were also perpetrators of violence during race massacres. The language says instruction includes acts of violence perpetrated against and by African Americans, but is not limited to the 1906 Atlanta race riot, the 1919 Washington, D.C. race riot, the 1921 Tulsa massacre, and the 1923 Rosewood massacre." So not only are we going to be teaching our children in Florida that slavery actually was beneficial, but that the people who were being most brutalized and victimized were some of the perpetrators. And then this week, there is a new top #1 country song called "Try That in a Small Town" by Jason Aldean. And this song came out with little fanfare a few months ago, but it skyrocketed to the charts this week in reaction to country music television refusing to show the video that depicted Black Lives Matter protests and a courthouse where people had been lynched. The response, instead of people taking the time to think about why that video combined with those lyrics might be hurtful for some people, the response in this country was to double down, get defensive, and go download the song en masse in order to make their point and make it skyrocket to the top. And so this is the world we live in. And I'm here today thinking about this phrase, each one teach one, and what that means for us in the year 2023. It's been almost 8 years, a little over 8 years, since June 17th of 2015, when a young white man walked into a black church in Charleston, South Carolina, and shot and killed 9 people. It's been 8 years since I wrote my first sermon explaining the difference between Black Lives Matter and All Lives Matter. I can't believe it's been almost 8 years since I've started talking about that. And here I am again feeling like it's time to revisit and continue to name the importance of taking the time to understand these dynamics, because in many ways I fear that if only certain people step up and speak out, we will be and are going to be moving backwards. It's like nothing has changed in 5 years or 20 years or 50 years or 200 years. It's like we just kind of keep coming around and around and around again. And so we can say, well, we don't have slavery anymore, or we don't have Jim Crow anymore, but we still have riots, we still have police brutality, and we have this kind of underlying paradigm that the people in power can do really anything they want to other people and claim that they can get away with it if they didn't feel safe. And it's not, I'm talking a little bit about race today as my example, but this is happening in areas of women's rights right now. It's happening with our LGBTQ community, especially with our transgendered community in this country, that there is organized and systemic, intentional legislation and oppression, literally rewriting history and rewriting laws to allow discrimination to take place. And I felt like I had this conversation over and over again during the Trump years, and it's been a little while since we've had this conversation, but I don't want us to get complacent and forget that there's a lot of work to do. I talk with people about the danger in processing grief by jumping directly from A to Z. When dealing with grief or a traumatic situation, I tell everybody to slow it down, take it step by step, move from A to B, and then to C, and then to D, and so on. And when dealing with grief, it just doesn't work to go from A to Z. You don't go directly from shock to healing. There are so many steps. There's denial, there's anger, there's grief, there's acceptance. And then you come in full circle and you begin to feel like you are healing eventually, but you move through the steps. And I believe that this is the same dynamic that is happening in our conversations about race, about immigration, about women's issues. In general, I feel like our culture, our society, has a tendency to collectively jump from A to Z. Oh, that is a terrible thing that just happened. We're all one. Let's move forward and be healed. And the Black community for generations and decades has been saying, along with other marginalized people, are saying, wait, No, we're in shock. We're terrified. We're scared. We're angry. We're confused. We are in pain. We are not ready to hear you quote Martin Luther King to us. We are still on step B, and you have bypassed it all and are asking us to go to step Z. And I think that that is what happens in our collective communities when it feels like there's just so much miscommunication and so much disconnect. It's because we have certain people who are moving through this grief process, moving through this trauma process. We have other people who haven't experienced that type of trauma. They don't understand it, they don't comprehend it on a heart emotional level, and so they can just jump right over, bypass the whole thing. They end up over here wanting everybody to just feel good, when the people over here are like, no, we're still like way over here trying to process the fact that we just got sucker punched and knocked down. We're not even standing up yet. We're not going to go give you a hug. And I feel like that is what is happening with immigration, with Black Lives Matter, with our transgendered community. And what's happening is now we have conservative politicians who are implementing legislation through their power, and we have conservative school boards who are now implementing what our children will and won't be learning. And so today, my invitation is just to remind us, we don't hear the phrases Black Lives Matter and All Lives Matter very often anymore. That we've kind of moved through that as far as our communities and cultures are using language. But I want to take us back a little bit to just exploring and reminding ourselves of what is that difference, and why did we have to explain the difference between Black Lives Matter and All Lives Matter. And the reason, and I've said this many times throughout the years, is that we cannot get to All Lives Matter until we are able and willing to acknowledge that Black Lives Matter. And you cannot get and acknowledge that Black Lives Matter until you acknowledge that we live in a culture and a system where for a long time, Black lives did not matter. And you cannot get to the realization that Black lives did not matter until, as white people, we are willing to look at ourselves and be honest about what our own barriers are to actually taking in that truth on a deeper, emotional, knowing level. And the fact is that this is a truth that, when looked at honestly, is almost too painful to see or acknowledge. And I think what we need to understand is that on a subconscious level, this is my theory at least, on a subconscious level we recognize our complicity in a system that is so unjust. And so we put up barriers to allow ourselves to become fully aware of the pain that this has caused as a self-defense mechanism. And the pain in removing that veil and becoming consciously aware of the hurt is so great that we keep the veil in its place and go to our feel-good comfort zone of beautiful Martin Luther King quotes on the left and Jason Aldean songs on the right. And in my opinion, neither response is helpful. And we are being asked to do better. For many years, I have been saying, now is the time. This is the place. We are the people. This is us. And are we willing to step up and show up in this new way? It is hard. It is scary. And we are needed. So because we haven't had this conversation for a while, this is my ask for today. I have 3 questions that I asked a few years ago that I'm going to invite us to contemplate and revisit. Do you understand the difference between All Lives Matter and Black Lives Matter? And it's okay if you don't. But if you're really struggling with that differentiation, my first request is to take the time to sit with it and struggle with it. Come and talk to me about it, or somebody that you care about and trust, talk to them about it. But really take the time to understand why all lives matter was a painful phrase a few years ago and still is in this point in history. A good starting point might be the book Me and White Supremacy by Layla Sayad. She does a wonderful job of helping white people sort of explore what's going on in our own psyches about some of these dynamics. Another step, another invitation might be to look and really pay attention to how language is used. I came across this Facebook post, it must have been, it says the other day, but it wasn't the other day because this is about 5 years old, but somebody wrote, "You keep saying it's horrible that an innocent black man was killed, but destroying property has to stop. Try saying it's horrible that property is being destroyed, but killing innocent black men has to stop. You're prioritizing the wrong part." We do this so often with our language, we don't even realize it. Sometimes when we're dealing with domestic abuse, and I know that domestic abuse isn't only men on women, it can be the other way around, but in this example, so often we say, Mary is a battered woman. But how often do we say, John is abusing Mary? It's almost like John's not even in the picture. John's not even in the sentence. It's all about Mary and what's happening to Mary. And we've totally erased John from having any ownership or responsibility in the phrase. And those are 2 very simple examples of language. Just the way that this culture is. I have a chaplain friend who's going through my chaplaincy program, and she's doing her internship placement is in a home for unwed mothers. And she kept referring to these unwed mothers. And finally, I was like, do you hear your language? Why are we labeling these young women unwed mothers as if their title, who they are, is relevant to their marital status? It's simple language, but language matters. And it just goes so easily into our unconscious and subconscious mind that we don't even realize the implication of what some of these phrases are actually communicating to ourselves and the people around us. And so the second question I asked this congregation a few years ago was, if you do understand the difference between Black Lives Matter and all lives matter? Does it feel safer to you to use the phrase all lives matter? And if so, why? And once again, my invitation is to get in touch with your own emotions and energy around this. Of course, all lives matter. That's what these 7 principles are. So that said, where is the resistance or the defensiveness when we hear Black Lives Matter? Is it because maybe it's kind of scary to put ourselves up and out and in front and in the front line of some of the backlash that we know we get, especially in this community, to that phrase? A few years ago, I had a man come in who wanted to have a conversation with me about why we had a Black Lives Matter sign up and what it means to us. And he came in, he was being very nice, but he wanted to let me know that there were some really nice white people that would never be entering into this church because we had that sign up. And I asked him if he would like to come in and have a conversation about why we put up that Black Lives Matter banner and what it means to us. And ironically, surprisingly, no. He had no interest in actually conversing with me about it or learning about us. He just needed to say his piece and be done. And so, if that phrase makes you uncomfortable, that's, like I said, okay. But are you willing to sit with it and go a little bit deeper to reflect on what makes you uncomfortable about that phrase? And finally, if you do understand the difference and understood what was going on between this war of words back then, were you able to articulate that difference? And were you able to stand in front of a friend or a family member or a neighbor and articulate why all lives matter was harmful to some people? And that's where part of my invitation is that that's a simple question, but it's not an easy thing to do. It's not an easy thing to find our words and then stand in our truth and then name what we stand for and believe to people, either people in our lives that we care about and care what they think, or people that we don't even know and strangers, and stand up and be who we are to strangers. It can be hard. It can be scary to stand up and name what we believe in. But it also means that we're pushing up against our comfort zone. And I think in the year 2023, it's a good time to continue to expand our comfort zones. I came across a video a few years ago from a spiritual teacher named Matt Kahn, and he had a lecture and he was talking about sacred activism. And I really kind of like that phrase, and I was intrigued by the term, and as he defined it, it's purpose-driven action rooted in spiritual principles of love and compassion. And I like that. I'm going to say that again. Purpose-driven action rooted in the spiritual principles of love and compassion. And he went on to define it as external, empowered decision-making that affects the greater good of all. I'm going to say that one again too. External, empowered decision-making that affects the greater good of all. It's a heart-centered approach, but it's an action approach, saying we're going to be in our hearts, we're going to be grounded, we're going to be steady, but we're going to be coming from a place of love and compassion, but we're going to be out there, and we're going to be taking action, and we are going to be speaking up and speaking out in love, but we're not just going to be quiet. And I really like that, because I don't really like to be around angry, mean people. I don't like to be around angry, mean people on the left, and I don't like to be around angry, mean people on the right. I just don't like to be around angry, mean people. But I love and I'm thrilled to be around loving, motivated people. And it's the loving, motivated people who get things done. And I guess I actually am already contradicting myself, because sometimes I have conversations in my head, and I don't actually agree with myself when I just said it's not okay to be angry. We need to get angry. And anger is a sustaining emotion, so it's okay to be angry. But I think what I'm trying to say is that we don't want to get stuck in the anger. The anger can generate action, but we can't stay in that anger, or we will become counterproductive. So I guess I need to rephrase that. I want to be around potentially angry people who are moving through it into something more positive. So I do want to offer a few words from Martin Luther King today, even though I once again said Martin Luther King, we have to be careful with how we quote him. But he actually said these words in 1966 at the Ware Lecture, which was the Unitarian Universalist General Assembly. So he was saying these words to Unitarian Universalists in 1966. And he wrote, it was called, his lecture was "Don't Sleep Through the Revolution." So this is from him to us. One of the great misfortunes of history is that all too many individuals and institutions find themselves in a great period of change and yet fail to achieve the new attitudes and outlooks that the new situation demands. There is nothing more tragic than to sleep through a revolution. And there can be no gainsaying of the fact that a social revolution is taking place in our world today. We see it in other nations, in the demise of colonialism. We see it in our own nation in the struggle against racial segregation and discrimination. And as we notice this struggle, we are aware of the fact that a social revolution is taking place in our midst. Victor Hugo once said that there is nothing more powerful in all the world than an idea whose time has come. The idea whose time has come today is the idea of freedom and human dignity. And so all over the world, we see something of freedom explosion. And this reveals to us that we are in the midst of revolutionary times. An older order is passing away, and a new order is coming into being. That was 57 years ago. And a lot of forward progress has taken place, and a lot of backsliding has taken place. But I think he is right that humanity is at a crossroads. A revolution is taking place. We see it all around us. The question is, which direction will we ultimately go in? Are we a part of this new revolution, or are we sleeping through it? Are we getting sidelined by anger and resentment, or are we living into our highest spiritual principles of interconnection and love? These are the questions of the time. Martin Luther King was a strong voice 50 years ago, But Howard Thurman was a strong voice before him, and Frederick Douglass was a strong voice before him, and Harriet Tubman was a strong voice before that. And the line of role models is long. The question is, will we be named among them? Is standing for justice scary? Yes, it is. Do we have the role models to lead us and guide us? Yes, we do. Rosa Parks is quoted as saying, "I have learned over the years that when one's mind is made up, that diminishes the fear. Knowing what must be done does away with fear." Knowing what must be done does away with fear. So sacred activism is the activism that comes from deep within. It's the activism that comes from an understanding of human connection on the deepest level. It's the activism that stems from knowing we are all interconnected, that we are all divine beings in the eyes of a loving universe. Jesus said, "I see you." The Buddha said, "I see you." Gandhi said, "I see you." Sacred activism is not being able to look away. It's not being able to hide behind the depths of the eyes of another. It's no longer attempting to convince ourselves that there is the other. It's a deep internal understanding that we are all truly connected and that the pain of one is the pain of us all. And it's understanding this on a deep, deep internal soul level. And so my question for each of us today is, what is your unique each one teach one? What might you go out and share today that will make life just a little bit better or more meaningful for someone else? Martin Luther King said, "Those who love peace must organize as effectively as those who love war." I think maybe it's time to get organized. And with that, let us sing in your Teal hymnal number 1017, "Building a New Way." It'll be nice when we have our choir back. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. Your way. It is the path you take. May love guide you on.